Welcome to Being Human. My name's Steve Cuss. I'm your host. So glad to be with you today. When I was first introduced to systems theory, that was 1996. For those of you just joining the show, systems theory is quite simply the ability to walk into any environment and notice the anxiety that's going on in me, and notice the anxiety going on between people. Where I first learned it was what felt like boot camp. It was the emergency room and intensive care units of a trauma hospital, of an urban trauma hospital. I was a hospital and also a hospice chaplain for a year. And one of the head chaplains there, in fact, he was recently on the show a couple of weeks ago, George Dobler, he introduced us to this thing called systems theory. So a lot of this show, even though we don't use that phrase very much, a lot of this show is driven by the simple idea that if you can walk into a room and notice the anxiety, you're less likely to catch it and you're less likely to spread it. And there's a lot of really deep tools. If you come to one of my intensives, for example, you'll discover some pretty deep tools that we do. But at its simplest, just walking into the room and noticing it can be a game changer. One of the phrases that came out of systems theory was called a non-anxious presence. And that leads us beautifully to our guest today, Alan Fadling. Alan is the leader of Unhurried Living. I've got links in the show notes to him and learning about him more. He's written a couple of fantastic books on how to live an unhurried life, something I think we all need. His latest book, The Non-Anxious Life. And so we get into that. And I just want to say a word because the phrase non-anxious can indicate that you're kind of like Yoda or like the Dalai Lama. But actually, non-anxious, maybe the best way to understand it is managed anxiety. So it's really about connection. It's not about being numb. It's not about being above it all. It's about being connected. And the best way I know to be connected is to relax into God's presence. This way, every week, we light our candle. For most of you, some of you watch this on YouTube, but for most of you, you're just listening to this audio podcast where we actually intentionally use what they used to call on the radio dead time, to pause, get off the anxiety treadmill. Because that's what anxiety does, is it puts you on a treadmill and then it says, try harder, do more of the same. And so just learning that you're on the treadmill so you can get off. And then you can do what the Bible commands, which is remember the Lord, relax into God's presence. I started my conversation with Alan just asking him how he first learned about systems theory. Alan, the title of the book is A Non-Anxious Life. That phrase non-anxious is famously or infamously a systems theory phrase. Maybe that was accidental, maybe that was on purpose. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, maybe a little bit of both. I am newer to reading, the writings of Edwin Friedman, and I'm making my very slow way through a failure of nerve, and it's slow because it's helping so much. It's so rich. It's so practical. It's so true, and so. Although I don't reference a lot of his writings in what I've written in this book, I have been finding him so very helpful. And I'm finding that anxiety is not just a personal dynamic, but I'm finding it to be an organizational dynamic. And that's where I'm feeling intersections with his theory and his work.
Yeah, the founder of systems theory, Murray Bowen, he coined the phrase that you use, to be human is to be anxious. You do so much work in the leadership space. I would imagine you have to do a little bit of convincing on that phrase for some leaders.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I said in the book, and I find this with a lot of leaders, there's an odd way in which we can almost imagine our anxiety as an asset. Like the way in which it drives us, pushes us to high standards or high levels of activity. I remember when I heard Dallas Willard once say, anything you could do in anxiety, you could just do a lot better in peace. And part of my soul said, boy, that's smart. That is so good. But another little part of me thought, I don't know if I'll get anything done if I don't have my anxiety.
Yeah.
And there was a crisis of motivation for me. It's like, what will move me if my anxiety isn't doing it? Because it's done it for me for so long. And that was one of the gifts of writing this book, was to discover there are other ways to have an edge. There are other ways to be moved and to stay engaged that don't require anxiety.
Yeah, I was fascinated on your own journey. You really became known as the unhurried guy. You took a deep look at your own soul's hurry and how it got in the way of your relationship with God. A lot of your leadership work has got a strong spiritual disciplines focus. And of course, anxiety has a relationship to hurry. But I love what you're saying here, Alan, about the idea that, man, if I'm not anxious, what's going to make me get stuff done? What's the difference between the kind of anxiety you need to get up and speak versus the kind of anxiety that makes you slam on the brakes and miss a car when you're driving versus the kind of anxiety you're talking about?
Yeah. So as I've reflected on my own experience of anxiety, which goes back to my earliest memories, and I tell a little bit of that story in the book, one of the things I've said is that my anxiety is what caring looks like when God is not much in the picture. It's like my caring with a very thin sense that God's with me and actually cares more. And that's been really critical to then realize sometimes my genuine care for a situation, for a person, has kind of gotten hijacked a bit. And I've imagined that my caring is the whole picture, and that I'm not caring in the context of a God who has a much greater care. So, for example, when I'm getting ready to speak, I feel those physical sensations of the butterflies and the racing thoughts and all of those sorts of things. Well, it's good for me in that moment to realize, and I say this to myself, I care about this. This matters to me. I want to serve these people well. That's very different than what I've let those feelings do in the past, which is, I may suck. This may be awful. I may really fail. So there's a very different perspective on those two. One of them is a very me-focused sort of vision, a response to those sensations and thoughts and feelings. The other is a much more God-aware, sort of a practicing the presence of God in the midst of my anxious thoughts and feelings.
You've brought up a couple of interesting things here, Alan, I'd like to explore. The first one is the way that we tend to center ourselves when we're anxious. If I'm hearing you right, you're suggesting that one source of anxiety is when we may not say it this way, but it's almost like God's obviously not caring enough. I must take it from here. Like, I don't know if that's what you're indicating, but in my life, I feel this incessant need to make everyone feel better, whatever it is. If they're in front of me and they're upset, I must make you feel better for me to be okay. It's quite self-absorbed. It comes from a good heart. Isn't that part of the challenge of anxiety? Some of it really does come from a very good heart, an earnest heart, but fundamentally we have lost sight of God in that moment.
Yeah, I like the way you said that. That's how it feels to me. One of the things I said in the book, and this has helped me immensely, is that we speak in the Christian life of practicing the presence of God. What I realize is that my frantic worrying is a kind of practicing the absence of God. And by that, I mean a practice that my worrying does tend to just center on me. It's the little bubble of me and my concerns and my fears and my projection into the future, with little sense that God is with me. And so it helps me to remember that one of the opportunities I'm being invited to when these familiar sensations, physical, emotional, mental sensations of anxiety arise, I can decide how I'll respond. And one of the responses that's been helping me is just the simple line from the familiar psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." My anxiety's message has tended to be, the Lord's not going to be there for you. You are going to be in want. They're very different projections of the future. And so for me, learning to let these familiar feelings of anxiety become triggers for a different kind of response or a different kind of activity has been helping me little by little navigate what sometimes feels overwhelming in terms of inner sensations of anxiety.
What I find tricky about what you're saying is you just gave us a beautiful contrast. I'll kind of put words to it, of the gospel of anxiety versus the gospel of Jesus. And which one are you believing in the moment? Psalm 23. Isn't it tricky though, Alan? Because in the moment, you don't realize you're believing that gospel, or that you don't realize you're falling into anxiety's grip. It's almost like you don't even know you're anxious. Is that true for you?
Yeah, that is exactly right. So part of the challenge for me has been learning to move from my autopilot response to anxiety, the lack of distance between stimulus and response, to use the language of Viktor Frankl. So my spiritual disciplines in part have been about opening up a little bit of space and a little bit of awareness. The ability to say, yeah, here is me on anxiety. This is not an unfamiliar place. Spiritual disciplines have opened up just enough of an awareness that instead of I am anxiety, it's no, I have anxiety. And there's a difference. And I now, feeling what I feel, having these thoughts that I'm having, I now have the freedom to decide how I will proceed. But I do need a little bit of awareness to be able to proceed in that way. Otherwise, as I said, too often in the past, my anxiety has just been me. I assumed it was my identity. I almost imagined it's how God made me. And therefore, this is just how I live. I'm just an anxious person, I would sometimes say. I'm not sure that's how God made me.
It circles back, as I'm listening to you, it circles back to what you said at the beginning, is like, how will I function without it? You're almost describing a Christian that has syncretized their anxiety with their faith. And it's one thing. They don't even realize it's two competing things. It's become one thing in their mind.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's odd. So one of the things I would say is, when we're looking at the New Testament language, a word translated anxiety can also be translated care. Paul speaks of his care for the churches. But that same word could be then translated in a different context, anxiety. So there is a bit of a blur, and there is a kind of intersection between genuine caring and that sort of anxious care that Jesus says, you don't need to do that. You have a God who cares for you.
You've picked a bit of a scab here with me, Alan, because that Greek word, when Paul says, do not be anxious about anything, I think some Christians read that and they say, well, now that's one more thing for me to be anxious about. I'm also failing at that. And yet I wish that the modern Bible translators would have had the courage to use the same word anxiety when Paul says, I face daily anxiety for the churches, so that we could realize that do not be anxious about anything is an invitation as much as it's a command. It's a aspirational thing, in my opinion. And as you write, to be human is to be anxious. Here's Paul, just like us, sweating occasionally some things that are not ultimately in his control. That makes me feel much more encouraged to know that Paul's kind of like us, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So we do have great concern. I am a parent of 3 young adult sons. I have many opportunities to feel profound concern for their well-being, maybe in response to the trajectory of their lives. There's, of course, as a parent, I'm omniscient and I know all things and I know exactly what will happen next for them. But I think in this, what I want to say is that when Jesus says, don't be anxious, I don't hear him saying something shaming.
Yeah.
Just knock that off. That's a sin. I hate the sentence, anxiety is a sin. That does not help anybody.
Yeah.
Nobody. How about this? You you could find your way to being less driven by anxiety than you've been so far. You know, being more awake and aware to the God who cares even more for you than those little birds that live outside where you work or where you live. You are cared for. There is something about that puts my cares into a kind of perspective. I have not found the plateau of peace where never again I feel any kind of anxiety. I still feel it daily. I do care about things that are happening in my life, in my work, in my world. I care. And sometimes that care drives me to frantic anxiety. That has not proven to be a great move. The thing I've sometimes said is the way I've listened to my anxiety, you would think I considered it a wonderful counselor. And maybe it isn't. Maybe it's not giving me great counsel for how to proceed. Maybe it's not a prophet predicting accurately and reliably the future that lies ahead of me. So in all of this, again, I come back to what does it mean for me to remember that the Lord is shepherding me in this experience that's just unpleasantly surprised me. And now I'm reacting as I often do.
Well, and speaking of the Lord shepherding, you have one of my all-time favorite quotes that I've ever read about Jesus and anxiety. I've got it here. Jesus cares for our troubles, but they don't worry him. What a sentence, Alan. Tell us about that.
Yes. Well, maybe this gets to your comment about how we've syncretized. We've sort of incorporated our anxieties into our faith as though this is the nature of the kingdom of God. The idea that which I worry about, number one, it sort of says that I understand enough to know what's going on. And maybe I don't. Maybe my current perception of this unpleasant surprise is not as full as the all-knowing, all-loving perception of Jesus. And so I like that idea that he knows, he cares, he sees, he is with me. But he's not overwhelmed like I'm overwhelmed. He is not paralyzed in the ways I sometimes feel paralyzed. He is not driven away from good activity the way I sometimes feel driven away by my anxieties. And so it's a perception of Jesus, I think, as a Prince of Peace in the midst of my sometimes being more of a master of anxiety than a master of peace.
And you said it earlier, but I do want to camp on it because it was another amazing passing phrase you mentioned that's covered more in the book. If it can be done in anxiety, it can be done better in peace. That's hard to believe. I'd love to hear more thoughts on that from you.
Yeah. Well, that was when I proposed this book 2 weeks into the pandemic. I envisioned one kind of book that I was going to write. And I thought the pandemic, like many of us, was going to last a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. I had no idea it would be the anxiety-provoking season of years that it proved to be in my own experience. And so when I heard this line, recalled this line from Dallas Willard, that anything done in anxiety could be done better in peace, that reaction inside of me, that, oh no, what will keep me moving? Part of my journey was, is peace a better way to do my work, for example, than anxiety? Is that just a nice sort of Hallmark card sentence, or is it operationally true? And the thing I began to realize was that whereas, yes, I had to admit that my anxiety had driven me to a lot of activity, pushed me to a lot of standards, if it's fuel that burns dirty. And its long-term effect was not good in my life, and it was not good in my work, and it was not good in my relationships. Whereas peace, a sense of well-being lived in communion with the God of peace, gives me access to energy sources like hope, or like joy, or like Paul, who says, the love of Christ compels me. Being compelled by love is a very different experience than being driven by anxiety.
So, Alan, you do a lot of work with leaders and teams. I'd love to hear two thoughts from you. We could take them one at a time. Talk to me about the leader who is anxious and doesn't know they're anxious. How are they behaving?
Mm. Well, I know when I've been the leader who is anxious but unaware, the problem I have is that I'm turning my work into an attempt to address my anxiety. I'm trying to solve my anxiety through what I accomplish or through what I solve or through what I do and inspire other people's good reactions to me. Like my work becomes a kind of implicit therapy for my anxiety, which I don't know that's what I'm doing. So instead of being able to be free and bring myself to my work, I'm turning my work into a project to resolve my own anxiety, which is very self-focused. And instead of bringing something to my work, I'm trying to get something from my work. It's a very different orientation.
And then tell me about the team. What do you see on a team when the leader is the most anxious person in the room, particularly if that leader's unaware of it? What are the impacts on the people that work for them?
Yeah, well, I'm going to imagine you have a lot more insight than I do, but in my experience, the problem is then the team, instead of being able to be focused on a shared outward-looking work, end up spending an awful lot of time managing that leader's anxiety. They end up creating implicit systems and habitual reactions. And a lot of time and a lot of energy gets spent navigating this under the radar anxiety. And that time and energy isn't available for a shared work to which God has invited us. There's just not enough freedom. There's not enough awareness of that opportunity. So that's at least one thing that I've noticed.
One of the things you encourage us to do in the book is kind of take an inventory of how much we are looking for God to remove our circumstances so we can attain peace versus how much we're inviting God into our circumstances so we can attain peace in the midst of it. I think that is a common human thing. Like when I take a assessment of my own prayer, I've been a Christian for decades now. Too much of my prayer is still, Lord, please take it away. Oftentimes, honestly, Alan, not for me. I'm too anxious to pray for myself. If I confess to you, one of my default beliefs is I'm not worth praying for. Therefore, I generally pray for others. But my prayers for others are, Lord, take it away. It's still, I struggle to say, Lord, enter into this chaos. But you really do have a vision for us to take stock and relax into God's sovereignty. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I realize, like your description, so many times the solution for my own anxiety has looked like God changing the world so I won't feel anxious. Well, just on the face of it, that's not going to be a great long-term strategy. Like if my peace depends on all the unpleasant things that surround me changing, what about everyone else's anxiety? How does the world have to change for them? Whereas when I think of Jesus as a Prince of Peace, what I imagine is that he is a presence of peace in the middle of my trouble. He is with me. We know what it feels like to be in the presence of a non-anxious person, even in a troubling situation. There's something good about that. And so to know Jesus as the Prince of Peace, in other words, the peace of the kingdom is a peace that arises from within our communion with a Prince of Peace, rather than mostly being the result of some situational or circumstantial change. Therefore, instead of trying to get some peace from a different situation, I can bring peace to a troubling situation. It's a much more potent sort of peace. It's the fruit of the Spirit. It's the presence of a Prince of Peace.
It's almost like what you've done in this book, I think, Alan, is you've actually helped us identify some presenting symptoms. Like when you go to the doctor and they're like, hey, what brings you? Oh, I've got a sore throat and a runny nose. It's almost like you've actually named those for us. I've got some written down here. Insecurity,
Yeah.
weariness, like an apathy. The engine that cares is down. You talk about despair. And what you're giving us in this book is letting these, rather than them having the last word, they're actually becoming a signal or an invitation for us to notice them so that we can relax into God. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So maybe one of the ways I would say it is, part of what I want the book to be is kind of diagnostic. I want it to help us see what anxiety may look like in our experiences. Now, obviously, I also want to address that, now therapeutic. I want it to help. But until I began to see what my anxiety was and what it looked like and how it surfaced and what it looked like at work and what it looked like in relationship, it was very hard to then address it. I was left mostly, as you said, with sort of, can you just get rid of this, please? Make this go away. I just think Jesus has a much more wonderful invitation for us. We could be changed. We could be transformed. In the upper room, Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. I find that an interesting sentence because they were about to be in the biggest trouble they'd ever experienced. Their Messiah, their friend, he was going to be arrested, and we know the rest of the story. Do not let your hearts be troubled. As though he were saying, don't let the trouble become the center of who you are. Let me be the center of who you are. He calls us friends. So it's this place of communion with the Prince of Peace that little by little through practice becomes a reliable center for who I am in the midst of real, tangible trouble that surrounds us. And that, at least for me, has been helping. So yes, it's trying to help us recognize the presence of anxiety. I realize how many times I've heard very confident leaders say to me as they've heard about this book title, "Oh, well, I don't have a problem with anxiety. I don't have a problem with anxiety." Well, what they mean is they don't have a problem with anxiety that looks like what I think anxiety is.
In my experience, those people, they think of anxiety as worry and fear and insecurity. They don't realize it's also having to be right. When people don't buy into their vision and they get combative, anger outbursts and things like that, those are all anxious responses. You must run into that a lot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the thing, that anxiety does not just have flight varieties or freeze varieties, but it has fight varieties too. And that is where I see sometimes as you say, the overconfident, bombastic leader does not realize how much of what they're doing is being driven really by anxiety, not by a holy confidence or holy boldness, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I'd be remiss in 2024. It's still a little early, but I'm going to take the chance. I'll be asking this question a lot of my guests in the second half of the year. How do we navigate an election year here in the USA, those of us who are in North America? How do we navigate an election year and our precious relationships non-anxiously?
Yeah. Well, maybe that'll take a whole nother book. I don't know.
Better write it soon.
Yes, I know. Well, I think what I would say is, first of all, most of us are unsettled already this year. Period. There's little sense as we look at the political situation, like there's this wonderful rosy outcome likely to arrive once the elections are over. It just sort of feels like a long morass of uncertainty and worse. So to me, again, I want to get up in my helicopter. I want to get to 30,000 feet, and I want to say, what does it mean that Jesus is a Prince of Peace when I'm in a world with little peace? What would it have been for the first followers of Jesus living in a Roman Empire, not a democratic republic, a dictatorship? What would that have looked like for them to be saying things like, do not be anxious? I have friends in Northeast Nigeria who live in places of great conflict. I have friends in other parts of the world who face incredible trouble. They are sometimes the most remarkably peaceful people I have ever met. They have learned in the midst of very real trouble to experience the presence of God as a presence of peace. And I think perhaps the intensity of this year in which we are finding ourselves could be an invitation to ask God, what would it look like for me to be a non-anxious presence in a year like this? Would you teach me? If he's the Prince of Peace, this is something that he wants to do in us and through us. Is it easy? No. Is it possible? I think the gospel says that it is. And I think it'd be a wonderful way for us to pray and to seek the work of God in and through us for the good of our nation at this point anyway.
Well, Alan, you've lived a relatively unhurried life, at least recently. You co-labor with your precious wife. You've successfully raised 3 young men. You've served organizations like Saddleback and global organizations like Crew and InterVarsity, but you have not yet successfully endured the gauntlet of anxiety questions. So without further ado, let's move into the second part of our interview. What is a character trait in another person that is guaranteed to trigger you into anxiety?
I think as I think about that, it's the person who has no sense of boundary. The person who has no sense of boundary, where they're just stepping over customs and just normal niceties, that pushes all kinds of buttons inside of me. And it takes a great deal of effort for me not to react in a moment like that.
I've got a follow-up question that's not on the gauntlet, but I'm fascinated with this, Alan. How close, have you ever had someone get way too close to you physically when you're talking to them?
Yes, close talkers are really frightening for me. Like something in me becomes about 6 years old, and it just takes everything I've got not to feel utterly overwhelmed by that.
Okay, so when you're in a situation, whether it's with a close talker or somebody who's just breaking through all the cultural norms and they're triggering you, what are you saying to yourself, or what are you doing so you can stay connected to them?
I think the thing that in any situation where anxiety is arising, I've developed this habit of remembering God is in me. There's this image, when you take a ship down in the depths of the ocean, the reason it doesn't get crushed is that there is a pressure pushing from within that is equal to the pressure pressing from without. And so for me, there's that sense of God is with me. This failure on the part of another to honor normal boundaries will not crush me. There is someone within me who is greater than that which presses on me. And that's been a practice of awareness, a practice of prayer that over time has helped me.
That's a beautiful answer. I love that. What's something that you think you need that you don't really need to be okay?
Well, as an author, what I often imagine I need is more fame. I need more people to be impressed or even to know. And I'm not sure that I need that. I sort of think, obviously, I'll do all the work anyone else would do, marketing and this and that. That's not the same as fame. Fame is about other people's opinion of me. And my recovery friends would remind me that their opinion of me is none of my business. And maybe that's a good thing to remember.
We all have a family of origin. We all bring assets and liabilities from our family of origin into our life. What might be one asset and one liability that you've brought into your life?
Well, I think an asset was the nature of our family meant had a lot of time alone and a lot of time quiet. I learned to be a reader. I've brought that into my leadership. I brought that, of course, into being an author. That's an asset. I dedicated one of my books to my dad, in part, reflecting that. In terms of liability, in terms of challenge, well, anxiety and all the ways in which that has driven me throughout my whole adult life. I had dedicated this book that we're talking about to my mom and to our shared journey with anxiety. So I think that's how I would respond.
Okay. One of the traits of anxiety is it puts us into attempted solutions that make the problem worse or keep them the same.
Yeah.
Does a story come to mind where you tried an attempted solution and it just kept things stuck or made things worse?
Well, this may not be the most impressive version, but what I realize anxiety does, it causes me to jump to conclusions and then act as though those conclusions were true. Just the other day, I cannot find my wallet. I am trying to remember where it was. I was at a restaurant. I call the restaurant. I look in the car. I start searching places in the house that could not possibly be, but I have to do something. This is my thinking process. In the end, my wallet had fallen out of my pocket in my recliner, and it was just sitting in between the cushion and the arm. There's this strange way my anxiety drives me to immediately imagine a certain conclusion and then act as though that were reality. And I miss a simple solution. This happens in a lot of different ways, in bigger ways as well.
That's a great answer. I think most of us who are followers of Jesus, we experience a gap between what we believe about God versus what we experience from God. Would there be a gap for you? Is there something that you believe to be true that you struggle to encounter?
Yeah, probably many. The one that comes to mind is, I remember Dallas saying, God is the most joyful being in the universe. I believe that to be true. If the fruit of the Spirit is joy, then yes. But I am also a bit of a pessimist by nature or by nurture or both. And so that is a place where maybe through gratitude has been helping me discover the reality of something I've believed for the longest time. But that's been a place of wrestle for me along the way, this experiencing the joy that is the nature of the kingdom.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. And the final question, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
I have to say this, the moments when I feel most loved are in the embrace of my wife. We have been married 39 years, and there's just something about our friendship and getting a hug in the morning or getting a hug at night that is among my most favorite moments of life.
Well, and not to be too graphic, but a see you after work hug is a different hug than a long hug. Yeah.
I like all the varieties of them. And so that's perhaps, they talk about love languages. Touch is a big one for me. And a hug has been one of the best ways to just in the moment find a sense of being beloved.
My guest is Alan Fadling. He came to my knowledge through his work on Unhurried Living, The Unhurried Leader, The Unhurried Life, his most recent book, A Non-Anxious Life, Experiencing the Peace of God's Presence. We'll have links in the show notes for you to grab that book and also to engage Alan deeper. Alan, thank you so much for coming on Being Human.
I loved being with you, Steve. Thank you.